Well, thank you everyone for joining us over the course of the day, to enjoy this array of papers from our distinguished guests, and also guests, and then Rosemary, who's really become one of the family here at the gallery with this ambitious project. We've covered quite a terrain, but we're hungry for more as always. So in this conversation, we'll be bringing together, I suppose, responses and thoughts, both a conversation amongst our panel members and speakers here today, but also we're keen to hear your thoughts as well. So I think I'll be looking to and fro a little bit and trying to, we'll keep the structure fairly loose and flowing over the course of the conversation. I thought it might be worth beginning just with a little, recap on what we've heard today. And, I think, Dietmar began the day, looking at these key friendships that, have been formative in Richter's life and his work. And for me, I think this sense of kind of the emotion and sense of playfulness in a way in these early years was very interesting, and the kind of poignancy of these strong friendships, their role, but then also splits and losses over that time. So a really interesting period to be looking at. Rosemary also looking into these early years with the fascinating materials from the archive and picking up on the play between what Richter was representing in the paintings and the way he chose to photograph them, I think quite experimentally, in this continuing place of working between the painting as a kind of object and then how it works in space, and his interest in the exhibition of his work and this kind of complex spatial relationship between the body as we look to these works. Stefan focusing on the overpainted photographs, this idea of a new pictorial hybrid, which seemed to raise some kind of sense of question amongst the group, and perhaps we can return to this. But I thought this idea of Richter as being, so literate to the extended traditions of art history over time, but also these rich local photographic traditions in Germany was very interesting to hear about. And Luke too took us on this journey from east to west, and from a young man, perhaps very influenced by the socialist context and collective context, pushing against this and finding his own language. But then, a very interesting manner of return, finding a different way to look to these same things of how we join together, the place of the collective. And this theme of return was something very much of interest to Rosemary and I. It's the title of the final kind of spatial chapter of the exhibition, and is a way of kind of pointing out these cycles of interest and patterns that occur over Richter's practice. Andrew spoke about the task for Richter to escape history, and looked at the place of these very formative early works, Aunt Marianne, Uncle Rudy, also the image of the family at the beach, this almost sense of a kind of subconscious to Richter's practice, his paying of attention with a certain form of consciousness. Then later, we discover that there are other layers to this history, and I think this, we've seen this again, this idea of return, perhaps in that, trajectory you set out, Andrew. There's these key points of development, and then in Birkenau, certainly this movement a coverage of a subject in the Holocaust that was perhaps too painful to deal with initially, but in 2014, Richter has again returned to. Perhaps in speaking of the Birkenau suite, that might be a way to take up the question that we had earlier about the place of abstraction in Richter's practice, because in a way I think in Birkenau we see him returning to abstraction, and even though this is at that stage an established part of his artistic vocabulary. Did any other members of the panel feel interested to speak about that, the place of abstraction, that question that was raised by our audience member? Or am I making that a little bit too broad?
Probably one thing that's worth noting is probably the majority of Richter's work is abstract in one sense or another, and if you just want to look at that series that's called The Abstract Pictures, it's by far the largest series, and it dominates his work from, say, the late 70s to quite recently, maybe 2009, 2010. So although the photo paintings get a lot of attention, abstraction's very much to the fore. Mm. And you could think of the blurring of the photo paintings, as people have, as being a kind of abstracting gesture as well.
But normally there is the traditional alternative, realism and abstraction. And I'm a bit surprised that normal discussions on Richter are opened with Catalogue Raisonné #1, table. And this shows everything as an answer, because it's both photorealistic and an abstraction of this. And I think this is a strategic number Richter selected to begin his Catalogue Raisonné. Dietmar will confirm it, that the numbers are not chronologically, so you can figure out that this setting of table as #1 has a programmatic value, and I think so. This picture gives the answer. There is no alternative in his work.
They're kind of embedded in each other in a way, aren't
exactly
they?
That.
Yeah. And this work, #1, it's an image from the 1960s, isn't it? Painted in tones of grey.
Yeah.
And you see the table in the artist's studio. I think that it's the place of production of the paintings. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there's also...
I think it's based on a magazine image from Burma. Okay. So it's an interior magazine, design magazine, so that it's an exemplary table of some sort.
Mm. And then there's this kind of grey gesture, kind of a smudge, but it's not yet a blur, but a kind of almost like
proto-blur.
Yeah. So we do get these two elements in countertension, don't we? Dietmar, could you tell us more about that process? You were working with Richter on the Catalogue Raisonné and this numbering process, and the beginning point is a very interesting thing.
I guess he shows this work exactly as a #1. There are other works that might precede it. There are works that we saw preceded but are destroyed, like the Pope and the Fire Squad. But these are works that are destroyed, which on the other hand does not mean too much, because another work, I guess it's #2, it's the Hitler portrait, is also destroyed a little bit later. It still was visible on film footage some years later, so it was only destroyed in maybe 65 or so. But it's also a work that is not existing anymore, but it has this #2. So it was, I would not call it problematic, I would call it programmatic, that he put it on #1 in his work. So on this catalogue with the numbered works, where he numbered through the mostly painting and sculptures.
Were you a part of that process, or when you arrived into the process, was it well, I suppose it had already been established, hadn't it, by him?
No, he did
earlier
it since
on?
he started in the late 60s.
Yeah.
And it came from documenting his works. So he was documenting his works with photographically and had cut them out from the negatives and put them together and numbered them. And so it started. And at the beginning, it also had only 4 numbers. And only, so the first version was only 4 numbers. And then later he had these sub-numbers because it went too high too quickly.
Yeah.
And there were groups that could be grouped together. Mm-hmm. So this is something that he started in the 60s, and it helped him to identify the works. It was easier to communicate with galleries or doing lists and know which work it's which one. Because after he had abstract works which are not titled with a name but only say abstract work or abstract painting or in painting or grey, it's difficult to identify them. So the numbers were very helpful at the beginning to identify the works. This is where it comes from. And then also with the very early works, they do not have, very often they do not have a number on the back because they were already sold. So you can see they were not in his hands anymore when he gave them the number. And some gave the number because they were still in the studio. And then at, let's say, like 67, 68, he numbered them continuously right after finishing the works.
Can I just ask a follow-up question on that? So if there's a work that doesn't have a number and you go to him and say this work isn't numbered and do you want to number it, does he then do that according to the time that request is made or according to the suite of works that it relates to? Does he go back in his numbering system or does he add on at the end?
No, because sometimes this happened because for different reasons there are substantial works that does not have a number but look like they should have a number. And he forgot probably to give them a number because he went out of the studio quickly. And then we discussed this because sometimes it's a question also that's not so easy to answer. And the number, then we know which year it is, mostly. So we have the year, then we look for a number of this year, and as there are the sub-numbers, you can put it in one of the sub-numbers. So you have 100-1, 100-2, 100-3, and then you can, if it looks that it fits in this time span, then you can make it 100-4.
And what kind of records are you working from? Are there, did he keep kind of registers with?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, they're listed with the typewriter years ago, and now they're listed in the computer and they're printed out. It's just a very simple list which has the number, the title, the measurements. When it's not all on canvas, it has a special information about oil on diabond aluminum. Yeah. And it has notes that it went to which gallery, with handwritten notes which were made later, where it went to. Sometimes also the owner who bought it, the collector who bought it. But it has notes like MG, it's Mary Goodman.
Yeah.
And a very funny example for this administrative attitude, like Buchloh would say, or something like this, is a print of 69, right?
16, probably 69.
69.
Bilderverzeichnis, yeah.
It's entitled Bilderverzeichnis, and it's a list of his early paintings. And this is a very humorous work of self-reflection.
Yeah, and there you still find difference in the numbers still. So that are not like the numbers like they are now. Also, a lot of works were added to that, even by him shortly after or so. So they showed up, or he found them in the studio. So a lot of works are still missing in that list also.
So it's an imperfect record, even as much as
he's not that perfect as everybody thinks he is.
Yeah.
So, because everything looks so ordered and looks so perfect and complete, also in order. So when you look also at the photographic archive of documentary photographs of the works, it's there. On the first view, you think he has everything. But when you look closer, and you need everything for catalogue resume, there are big gaps also. Yeah.
It's something that struck me over the course of this exhibition, and learning from Rosemary's kind of knowledge of Richter's approach as an artist is. I think I'd come into this seeing him just as a very significant, acknowledged artist of great stature, but it's lovely always to get closer to the human side of the artist. And this is something, Dietmar, in your talk I found very interesting, and something that arose for me. I was interested in the impact of Blinky Palermo's death upon Richter. It sounds like a very significant friendship to have ended. Is that something that...
I cannot say very much more about it. This was in a time when I do not have contact to him, and I have never really spoke that much about his relationship to Blinky Palermo with him. So what I have not mentioned is Blinky took over his studio, Gerhard's studio, when he moved to a new studio. So Blinky Palermo took over that. And they were both close related to Heiner Friedrich, to the gallery. Blinky Palermo at the end even more, so he went with Heiner Friedrich to New York and made there his last large series, homage to the people of New York, which is looks very much like the Reichstag's flag by Gerhard Richter with his colors black, red, and yellow, and that also seems kind of relationship between these works over the decades.
That long time, yeah.
I have a sort of unverified comment to make on that. I know that work by Palermo was big glass sheets with paint behind them, and I think not long thereafter Richter did return to making works with glass, which he hadn't done for a while, which he then paints grey on the back side, and it almost feels like a kind of grey echo of the coloured work that Palermo had done shortly before his death. So I don't know if that was a response to the death or not, but it feels like a very fitting kind of an echo to that project.
And Luke, you've worked a little in the archive also, and could you tell us a little bit about the, how that sits with you as a resource in the research process? Because it's a very, it's something extraordinary to be able to call upon, isn't it?
Yeah, it's certainly great that this place you can go and everything's already organised for you and available, and you can arrive and just have things there for you as and when you need them. It's fantastic. I spent a few days there, and there are these nice binders of photos that have been printed out from negatives and things like that. So I found tons of material that, especially destroyed works, that are documented there, and just helped me to sort of think about gaps in the chronology that aren't represented very well visually. And then, some of the photos we've seen today, like Richter's photos of works on his studio roof and things like that. So just once in a while, an image like that will really jump out as suggesting something about the work itself. It's not just a document. So, absolutely fantastic.
And it certainly speeds up research as well. When I first started working on Richter, whilst the archive existed, I didn't necessarily go there as my first port of call. I was resorting to fairly traditional library-based research. Obviously, over time, more and more materials become available online, including the rather good resource that's the Gerhard Richter website that has nothing to do with the studio, but is certainly a very time-saving device, as we know, and although not absolutely accurate and not as accurate as Dietmar's documentation and databases, still very good. So I think the work of the archive is extraordinary, that just accelerates scholarship on Richter, and it allows more people to access that material, but it just means that you can achieve more quickly and move on in what it is you're doing, because the foundation's already been laid down for you, not just in terms of what the archive gathers, but also the publications that come out of the archive, Dietmar's work obviously, and then how other scholars such as Stefan use that material and go on with it. So it's an extraordinary resource and a very important thing, and it's very easy to understand why Gerhard Richter would be very supportive of that and actively involved in establishing it and maintaining it.
I was just thinking I might pick up on kind of a topic we thought we might get to yesterday, Stefan, in our conversation, but didn't quite reach. And I think you mentioned to me an interest in the October series, and a sense that this idea of, and correct me if I'm I'm not so much meaning to quote you here, but I'm thinking of this idea of unfinished business, and I recall you mentioning that suite as being closer, maybe the problems that it deals with has been closer to your generation, and I was wanting to ask you whether perhaps that connects into this sense of unfinished business, that there's still aspects of that work that you find, perhaps relevant to events in the world today?
Well, I'm not sure if it comes really to unfinished business, what I'm thinking about this, but you're right. This series of paintings is attracting my generation, which grew up with this terrorist atmosphere in Germany, which is so far away from contemporary Germany, very much. And so we are nearly forced to repeat our experiences we made with this special form of Germany, looking at these paintings which were painted 10 years after. And by the way, just by chance, 1 year before the reunification of Germany. It gives me, when I'm here and seeing Birkenau for the first time, this is a completely different reception I have. I didn't experience Birkenau. I was grown up as Dietmar was in a generation that we just have to feel guilty in Germany, but we don't make ourselves the experience of this time. And now seeing Birkenau as a kind of abstract series, I would say, to me, I'm not so empathetic to this series because it has no reference to my biography, and moreover, it is abstract and don't gives me a visibility reference to what is behind this. And so, with the question of historical painting, I would say, as a kind of provocation here, Birkenau failed.
So as a window, in a sense, to return to our architectural metaphors, it's closed to us, or it doesn't open in the way that October opens.
Definitely. Yeah. It's a closed window, not the open one.
Yeah. And I suppose Richter is constantly moving between these more closed, more open windows. You know, the grey paintings often seem to, you know, push us back in a way, and others that we think we can look through, you know, we see some kind of intervening substance. But I mean, it's interesting that I think we want him as an artist we regard to successfully carry this mantle of the history painting, and I think you know, this was something perhaps implied, Luke and also Andrew, in your papers as you follow this trajectory. You know, whether it's through the relation between the personal and the broader realm, or even the movement from you know, collective, personal, back into, I suppose, telling a story for us all that we can share in. I think this was something I was interested in, us bringing Birkenau here to Brisbane. You know, as we, you know, think and don't think over our own history here in Australia. Doesn't sound like a question, does it?
The difference is that I guess that there is a different generation for Polk and Richter. They grow up like Ensler and Barter, saying they never told about this because the first priority, the first decades were just to survive. So even though there was the Nuremberg trials, they have this sense that everything that was swept under the carpet. So Polka's great provocation, this one of Kunst macht frei, is sort of quite radical for Polka and quite directly political, but given the situation of the time, there was this sense of the Adenauer years is very repressive, you're not talking about everything, we just get on, and Ensslin has a quote like that, it's all good to have lots of cereal and blah, 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 but there's more to life than this. And that's where she originally gets involved with that critique of that economic miracle. It's a bit empty, and that's where. So that's a different generation, really. There's a different thing that they're addressing. So to bring that forward is quite. You're addressing something that's not there. So Uncle Rudy and all these things are quite different, and that's what I was trying to point out with every. The afterlife of these things is that it's not you escape history; it's inescapable. But because history, it changes itself, you have to engage with different contradictions at each time. So our contradictions are not the contradictions of Richter and Polka, but they're quite different. But he wants to embrace, if you like, these polarities, like, and I agree, it's abstraction and figuration, you put them together, and that's how you break through it. But by the time he gets to, I would say, the October series, there is still a lot of contradictions, but he doesn't identify. That's why I was trying to do that portrait of Ensslin. It's like, I can see it, but I don't agree with it. So there's this attraction pull, and it's not working through a contradiction. That contradiction stays. We're not going to go down that path anymore. There was a recent conference about the Russian Revolution, the centenary, and a famous historian, Sheila Fitzpatrick, Australian actually, but of the Russian Revolution, said that we've got more information than the people had at the time who actually were in the revolution. We've got more information, we've got more historiographical explanations, but we're further away from understanding that moment because we're in a completely different situation. We don't have that sense of that revolutionary splitting that was pivotal to that moment. So in a funny way, we know more, but we know less in a way, or we don't experience it the same way. We can't.
One of the things that perhaps I'm picking up on slightly from just general discussions with Stefan and Dietmar is that a certain quizzical interest in why we would be interested in German history, and I suppose this also comes back. I suppose this also comes back to the question of history painting and things like the October series versus the Birkenau works and so on. And I know through our discussions over time, in terms of our list of works, our wish list, we were very keen to acquire the October series, and that seemed to be a very obvious choice, given Richter's work and the centrality of that series to his work. But it also seemed incredibly obvious just in terms of the state of the world and where we are at the moment. So when we talk about terrorism, we're talking, I mean, obviously the specific episode changes in terms of the Baader-Meinhof gang, and there's no equivalence between those people's ideological agenda and current terrorist agendas. But the idea of the threat and a sense of safety and a sense of anxiety about these issues seems to be something that is thoroughly global. And there's a lot of things about globalism that I find quite disheartening, but compared to the sense of nationalism that often drives terrorism, it strikes me that the fact that we're all in this same situation together and that we feel very strongly for what it might have been to be living through the Baader-Meinhof years, or what it might be to be in the UK or in Germany or in Spain under a terrorist attack. And in Australia, I guess we sort of wait to see how and when it will happen here with a certain sense of inevitability. So the question of whether Richter's succeeds in history painting or not, I think is, of course, important. But on the other hand, when you're trying to produce an exhibition that speaks to an Australian audience, certainly about Richter's work, but about broader issues in history and the state of the world, then it's almost necessary that you include those political aspects of his work, which are not so many, but that he doesn't pull back away from, and that's one of the things that makes him an interesting artist. So I think from an Australian perspective, maybe that seems more obvious than it does from a European perspective. I'm not sure, but I did notice the curiosity around that idea.
There's a question.
With that in mind, Rosemary, how successful do you find the September 11?
Oh,
Or anybody else having
So good question. So if I
You go.
take the position of Rosemary, I would say, so for iconographic reasons, it's very rational to put this at the end, because she started with a bomber plane from the 60s, and this is a repeated motive that Richter is repeating some topics from his earlier work and is following this to his later work. But I made a symbol to you, or a gesture to you, that I really like this question. And it's just because I was also very skeptical if it works out with this edition, which comes from a painting, because to me this work, or this motif, is too well known to make it a painting or a work of art of. There is no need to discuss this topic in fine arts, because the consensus is absolutely there in society. You don't have to discuss this topic, absolutely clear to everyone, which is completely different with October, or also different with Birkenau, but this motif is...
So are you sort of saying that, given how many images as well that there are, what does Richter's image add? So with October 18, the images add something,
And also the presentation of this edition between the glass. This is nice, but is it more? So don't tell it again.
No. I understand your point of view entirely. And in fact, that's a work that when I first saw it in the painted version, I was quite repelled by, for the reasons that you're describing. And I thought, why would he go there? Why, that's just too much. Why would you do that? For me, the work is actually more interesting in the reproduced version of it, because at least in terms of what one of the things that we're saying about Richter's work is that there's a certain degree of a networking and a consistency of that networking and return and circularity in some ways. So from the point of view of his exploration of medium relations, then to begin with photography, the mass media, to go back to that in 2009, after having concentrated on that in the 1960s, is consistent with that idea of him never letting go of a particular mode of making art. The only way that I can think that that is I can think that it's a useful work in the context of our exhibition, but aside from the exhibition, the only way I can think of it as being a useful work within Richter's broader oeuvre is the idea that he's pointing out something about the circularity of distribution and dissemination of images. The fact that it is so recognisable is like proof of the way that images influence us and that we're subject to them. To me, it's too much proof in that overstatement of that. And the way that I came back to thinking, well, maybe it's okay, was just the story that Richter and his wife were themselves, I mean, we kind of all experienced that event because it was so shocking, but they were travelling to New York, am I right to say this at the time? They were travelling to New York and their plane was diverted because of that event happening at that time.
I made the same experience.
Yeah, so, and
but don't like the painting.
yeah, I can understand that still. But for me, that was like, okay, this is something that is very much part of his direct experience, and perhaps that makes some compensation for it. Yeah, I think it's a little too obvious, but...
Can I ask, the bomber planes that Stefan mentions, and you've got this footnote of planes, were you trying to make a reference? Is there a focus on planes as weapons?
Within his work overall?
Or why that subject keeps repeating for him?
Well, partly because
because he's born in Dresden and there's this childhood experience of this?
But also I think planes were part of mass media and glamorised in mass media. So things like the Phantom interceptors as an image were an exciting, dramatic image. And we've just recently had river fire here in Brisbane, and our visitors won't know what that means, but it's essentially like a festival of the city, and part of that festival is an enormous fireworks display that includes our military planes flying through the city in formation and doing spectacular things. And do they still make the burning bit? No, they don't do that anymore. Anyway, helicopters and planes fly through the city and everybody runs out and goes, wow, fantastic. People camp out along cliff tops and in order to have a good view, and everybody's dog goes completely crazy.
So you think it's more like that?
Well, everybody runs out to look at those warplanes and they're terribly excited and take their children to do it, and they're looking at the hardware of destruction and death. And I mean, yes, defence, hooray, but they are weapons of destruction.
But it's a different experience if you're like 10, 13 and you see a city destroyed.
Well, Richter, speaking to that point, does say that when he was young, because he was very young during the war, there was an element of sort of fun and play to the whole thing, playing at being a soldier and things like that. So that doesn't necessarily, I'm not saying that relates to the fighter plane painting specifically, but that kind of is in the mix.
I think it's like a motive.
And I think he talks about the freedom of that period, not having to go to school, and that the life was less structured. So I think, things are never entirely black and white, are they? And I was interested, as we were unpacking that work, knowing what it represented, but talking to our crew, just asking them, what do you see in this? And, it could be the various different people I asked, but, they're pretty visually literate. But it took a little while for them to realise, without the title, what was being represented. And, I think sometimes for us this is a dilemma, for instance, with wall labels and the question about, telling the key story or the key narrative, when in fact artists often are interested in a realm of ambiguity. And I think with Richter, chapter so quickly. We're trying to find a place with a key narrative. But with that work, I was really interested in this idea that he'd painted it, and then after scraping back the canvas somewhat, decided that it was ready to be a work released into the world.
But maybe there's also another aspect connected with this painting, and Dietmar is better in this time, so maybe he could proceed with this argument. At that time when this painting was made, pop art made a real influence on German art scene. Mm-hmm. Maybe there is a reference to this.
Probably yes. So, but also it's like it's a good image in some way when you find it in a magazine and you see it. It's a dramatic image. It has power. It's something that you obviously may choose to paint it. Yes, so it's a lot of works that he chooses from the magazines are very small. You wonder, and you do not even at the first sight you recognize them because they are really like this, and they're difficult to find also in the magazine. So I looked it all up, all the years from the magazines that are published at that years, and sometimes they're really hard to find. And to identify. Maybe looked over some of them. And this is a really very dramatic, very strong image, so it maybe kept his interest. Therefore, there are also other works that deal with war planes at that time. So it was something that he was still interested a lot in that years 30, 63, 64. So it probably came from his experience during war, because also in the cityscapes he was working. His interest from the time in Dresden, the bombing of Dresden and the war situation was in these cityscape paintings. So Rosemary mentioned this when she gave the tour, that with this image we have here in the exhibition, and even more with the ones that are painted a little bit later in 1970, that are directly from above, where we really had the impression that he shows us, or painted, destroyed cities. Yeah, so he was really, over the years, even if it was 20 years later, was still interested, and from these in images from his memories during wartime, or even also after war, because when he was studying there in the 50s, Dresden was still very much destroyed, so they still ran through the destroyed city when they went to school or to university there.
And even in Dresden today, there's a very strong reminder of Dresden in ruins. So it's very, as you walk around the streets and look at souvenirs, and so it's very easy to see many photographs of the destruction of Dresden and many reminders of just how much a pile of rubble it was for so long. It was extraordinary.
Yeah, you still see when I first when I started in Dresden, I went a different way to the city, and you still see the holes in the houses from shooting.
And there were melted lampposts right up to nearly the late 50s.
Really?
So blocks and blocks. Yeah. There's a question here.
Yeah.
Very patiently.
Starting out with a commentary, I think if I could recall correctly, I also did a painting of Spitfires that I think it's not a black and white and color, so that would be just in line with warplanes.
Yeah.
But the question I want to ask to the panelists, so Richter dealt with political topics and had a stance or position to those. However, even addressing personal experience. However, what I do not recall seeing, or in his oeuvre, even in other exhibitions, did he address and deal with the Cold War, or even more to the point, the competition of two political different systems? And in the same sense like he did with World War II, or maybe also with 9/11. So.
Yeah, probably the phantoms are also dealing with the Cold War, and there are other. So the images he painted of airplanes are different. They are Second World bombers. That an image is very often used now. Also, I saw it at least several times used also related to the Dresden bombing. It's on books. It's a book cover, not the Richter painting, but the original source image. It's used as on a book cover, and it's related to the Dresden bombing, actually. And there are others that relate, where the image is an actual contemporary airplane, military airplane. So this has probably also to do with the or getting back in weapons for Germany, building up a new army or so.
Those phantoms, the early phantoms, are Vietnam area, more to a Vietnam in that sense. So for a rearmament of Germany would have been starfighters with F-104 different airplane type, though. So, but again, the question of Cold War, did he address that and deal with in a broader context?
In a broader context, not, I would say.
There's a book by John and Kirrihi, Blurred Visions, Andy Warhol and Gerhard Richter's Cold War Visions, Cold War something or other. Anyway, so he talks about the role of images in the Cold War and how you needed images to promote certainty for your ideological position. And when there wasn't certainty with an image, like the images around the Cuban Missile Crisis, ideology rushes in to fill the void. And so he then argues that Richter was very alert to the role that certainty and ambiguity can play in and around images. And so even if he didn't address the Cold War iconographically, aspect of what Jay calls Cold War visuality seeped into Richter's work, and in fact Richter could be said to have helped define the kind of blind spot, or point to the blind spot in Cold War visuality.
It's an interesting response, Luke. Just a question up the back.
Yes. Hello. Firstly, thank you for your papers today. It's been really fascinating. Andrew, you mentioned in your talk the idea of the authentic action, and I was thinking about this and the rhetoric of doubt, but also the seriousness with which Richter pursues this idea. So working through that sort of period of postmodernism where there's a heavy rhetoric of irony, it doesn't strike me that his work engages so much in that, but that it's a much more kind of authentic questioning. But what I actually wanted to ask was, having all pursued such an in-depth engagement with his practice, if there were experiences of encountering a work or a series of works that individually for you had a big impact, because I think the experience of his works are the thing that really drive this amazing kind of trajectory and significance of his work. So I was just interested in that as a personal response from each of you, what you had experienced that motivated or pushed your inquiry, perhaps in an affective way.
Is this for me?
For all of you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I just want to say that bit about the authentic. It's actually tries to recalibrate that idea that authentic vision had to be this vanguard vision where you know everything and it's all mapped out in advance and that justifies everything you do. And he's sort of critical of that, obviously. And that's why he was read as a postmodern ironist. In the 80s, everything was read in that term. It was always...
It doesn't seem to be framed in quite that way now, though, which is
no, but that's my point about the afterlife. It always gets recalibrated. Richter may be doing, but we're all doing it in a different way. I guess the point, the continuing point that's really important about that confrontation, even with the Ensslin portrait, is that he's sort of saying that we have enough zealots in the world who are completely sure about everything, and they'll tell us this is one of our problems today. There are zealots everywhere who are totally sure, who are narrowing our options, and it's just what we need. Maybe this is trying to create a space where you can talk about complexity and nuances of meaning. So that's one of the points I was trying to get at. So in the short answer of that is that's why I focused on the portrait of Ensslin. I got a lot out of it because it wasn't the whole series. I just thought that portrait as a series of 3 things was really resonant to me. That's why I spent time
Andrew,
on it.
does that mean then that in terms of the question around affect, is that's a work that impacted you emotionally?
Yeah, I just said that. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I really like the turn of looking at it as a Richter self-portrait in some ways, because it's his confrontation with that moment and someone who looks right at you and not sure what they're looking at anymore.
That's nice.
Dietmar, what about for you?
I have not really understood the question. Sorry.
Is there any particular work of Richter's that you'd like to talk about in terms of its your personal engagement with it, its impact upon you at an effective emotional level?
Oh. Okay, well, I might come back. Think about it.
You think about it,
come back.
yeah. Okay, thanks, buddy.
Rosemary, I know you have quite a strong experience, Rosemary. Don't you?
Well, I do, but I mean, I've got a number of different experiences. The broadest thing I'd say at the outset is that we're all talking about Gerhard Richter's work because we are struck by it. You do not commit yourself to this sort of investigation without being struck by the artist's work. And I think that all the people who have been speaking are speaking very much from the artwork outwards rather than from some distant intellectual inquiry. I know for me that when I first engaged with Richter's work, it was in actuality as opposed to in reproduction. So I'd seen it in reproduction, it had been, that's interesting, but I had that sort of detachment. But when I saw the Emma work in New Haven, and I forget which particular tour I may have told this story on, so if you're on that one, I'm sorry to have to repeat it again, but that work was something that I did feel quite affected by, and at the same time that I had that experience, I felt manipulated, so I had this sense that I was responding to a work, but I was responding to a work in a way that was very much, I was being pushed around by the artist, and that was okay, but I wanted to understand that a little bit more, and that's why I started to inquire into Richter's work, and as soon as I did, of course, I was completely confused by the diversity of the work, but I came back to, I felt unable to account for the Richter's work, and I still feel that inability in its entirety to account for it, but I decided to concentrate on the relationship between photography and painting because that seemed to be the buttons that he was pushing in painting through photography. So that certainly affected me. But that was sort of when I was young and naive, and probably whilst I'm still interested in that work, I've seen so much of Richter's work since then. The most sort of profound engagement, I think, is probably with the October series, because I've also read a lot about what he says about that series, and read some, not as much as Andrew, but some about the politics of those times and so on. But there are also some abstract works that you cannot help but respond to in a very immediate way as you stand in front of them. But I don't think that you can really respond in reproduction. I'm not absolutely sure about that, but I am sure that there's something about the paint on canvas and the experience of the scale of those works and that emotional impact that you need to be in front of the works. But that's just a few of my impressions that I hope address your question.
That's a really good question. Really, it's the only question, right? The only question about art. So I love the abstract pictures, but there's some works that seldom seem to get included in the big Richter shows that I want to kind of enter a plea for. And I did show one during my talk, and those are the red, yellow, blue paintings from the early 70s, where he would just put sort of dabs of the primary colours on the canvas, and then maybe he'd use a little bit of white too, and then he'd use a sort of quite long, supple brush, and he'd just blend them together, and almost like I imagine him conducting the symphony to make this painting. And he wasn't really planning much. I did talk to him about this a little bit, and he said he did pause and look at them, and he didn't just paint them in one session. But by the time he was done, this work that was sort of made in a semi-idiotic way, these works are actually very beautiful. And some of them, this one in Dusseldorf, instead of being just completely this undifferentiated mess, which is the risk when you make a painting like that, it's sort of this very kind of luminous, softly kind of pulsating surface. And to me, the gap between the departure point and the end point is just really quite astonishing, and I wish those paintings were kind of more in circulation than they are.
Well, I can't add anything else to Rosemary's statement. Just it's no chance that I spoke on photography, the overpainted photographies today, and with biographical respects, I already said when we had this public tour yesterday that when I studied art history, my professor was not very in favor of Richter, nor in Polke, by the way. And when I came to the museum in Bonn, where I worked for 20 years, I saw the family at the seaside, which Andrew showed here today, day by day. And so I was totally confronted with this contradiction between photography and painting day by day, and I thought, well, my professor was wrong. And so I started to do research on it. And the second point for me, which was very interesting, was the concern or the research in the additional work of him, which shows me that his concern about photography and painting or pictures in general is so complex that it is much more complicated, much more intellectual, at the same time as visible, satisfying to me than much more other artists of our times. And yeah, that's the point which affected me a lot and still do.
It's a great work when it sustains your interest over such a long period, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I can step in. So there's one painting that I really love specifically, and I think it also stands out. This is a small scale painting. There are a lot of, not a lot, but many other scale paintings that he did. And this is the most beautiful one because it's small and dense. And I remember it because I had it in my office when I worked for him like 25 years ago.
You can't fall out of a
And
love.
so I had it each day opposite to me next to the window. And this is, I'm very familiar with, and it's like meeting an old friend when I see it now. Yeah.
And where is it now?
It's
Now
in
it's
your
here.
private collection, yeah?
It's still it's private collection set. It said it's private collection, which it's still his. Yeah.
So it must be sad not to have it over the way from you.
Yeah, I passed that opportunity, I guess.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe you can convince him to make an edition of it.
Yes.
Yeah. You can again
There's
have
an
it.
edition now.
It's an edition.
There's an edition now.
Oh.
Yeah,
So why
but
don't you have it in your office?
I have it. I have it privately now.
Probably.
It's at home.
Excellent.
And it's more convincing at the edition, I would say, the September edition. It's a very good edition. When you see it, you will agree.
You will want it.
We'll look it up immediately. And a question in the centre here.
Yes, I have a question for Dietmar. I think it's a great opportunity of having someone here that has been looking at the archive. How much would you say that his whole production up to now, how much percentage is, because I can see this duality where there is one part very intellectual and political and the other part completely abstract, like in the Kandinsky or Jackson Pollock or Rothko sort of philosophy, the painting itself, for itself. How much in percentage would be that part of abstract painting that is done over his period?
Abstract is something different in his work, because there's this series of abstract paintings that started in 76, and which is the large abstracts that we also see here, the colorful ones. And then there are other abstract paintings that are like in paintings in gray, or the gray painting is also an abstract painting, in paintings in red, yellow, and blue. So the series of the abstract paintings from 76 on, I would say it's also that is about now 60% of his work.
So overall, his life, there would be about
it's
60% was abstract.
Because it's there are a lot of small works also that are not in the large museum shows, and I would say it's about 60% of his complete work. So it's when we look at the political related works like the October Cycle, so there are very few, but they get more attention. So you overestimate them in number probably.
Yeah, and also related to the abstract, was it a connection with the him being in Germany and the abstract from the 60s and 70s in New York? Because there is a lot of similarity. I've noticed some similarities with Pollock and
No,
Rothko.
I don't think so.
There was no connection or no relation between him and them?
I see it more with this very small, tiny paperwork that was shown here, that was related to the Documenta 2. After he visited this, he did these experiments with abstraction. And this was very much related to Pollock, what we can was really very obvious when we saw both the Pollock in the space from the Documenta and the small Richter that he did in 1959. But you can't really relate his abstract works from the mid-70s to these abstract works by Pollock, Motherwell, or others. There's not a relationship, also not in doing that, also not a mental relationship to it.
Thank you.
I've got a question for Stefan. Stefan, you said before you were commenting on Birkenau and the titling of the work as an abstract painting, and you indicated that as a provocation that you thought it was I don't think you said failure, but it wasn't successful in its attempt to bring to light Birkenau. It didn't work for you in some way. I just wondered, to me it seems really interesting, an experiment, quite an unusual work in the exhibition, and you've talked about the kind of intellectual pleasure in Richter's work. So I wanted to make a plea to you that you reconsider that work, perhaps in light of a work like Barnett Newman's Stations of the Cross, which similarly is an abstract work series, but one in which the viewer, in the end, does the imaging. And I just thought, maybe with this subject in particular, it would be too much to image as a photo, as a photographic type painting. So his strategy may be actually be very, very interesting. So that was the question or the response to your provocation, I suppose.
Yeah, so I see that my provocation finds addressed to you, and it was at the same time a provocation for Geraldine, because she published an essay in the catalogue on it. Yeah. So what I would just like to say is this is a really hot topic to paint Birkenau. And when I saw it here for the first time in original, I thought, well, do I get the feeling from that engagement with Birkenau, which is serious from Richter? He's absolutely serious, and I think, as far as I know, the first title was untitled for his, is it right?
Yes, he wanted to have it untitled. He does not want to have this, make it public. So he does not want to make it public, but then he spoke about it in an interview with the press. So and then it was it became public. So he then also changed the title.
And I think, well, you are right with your comparison to Barnett Newman, and unfortunately I haven't seen it in original, and so I absolutely agree that you can get from the experience of an abstract painting a reference to an historical event which, or well, situation which attracts you very strongly. But I think the model which Richter normally used by discussing historical issues is different, and it mostly works on a visual level which is more directly. And so, for instance, in October or in the 9/11 painting or so on, and this differs so much that I was a bit of surprised that he entitled this work with Birkenau. I'm not convinced, but I'm just provoking a bit, Geraldine.
And I mean, I was really interested to be in the presence of those works. I wrote the piece prior to that, but you know, I felt that it was important, you know, to bring them into the exhibition. I was very interested in them, as we often have in Australia, the experience from afar. I'm not sure if you're aware that the paintings, the suite began with Richter looking to work from the Sonderkommando images and beginning to take a much more representational approach to that material. But, you know, I'm not quite sure. This is a kind of problem of storytelling as a curator, and how much of the story you tell, and that when there is an element of representation or narrative, that can end up kind of blitzing out these kind of other modes of thinking. And so whether Richter decided to turn to abstraction because he felt representation failed, I'm not entirely sure that's the case. Maybe it's a kind of a process of working through. And you know, something I found interesting and particular in those works is this slightly kind of toxic combination of colours, and that's something that gives me a kind of physical sensation, but I don't think you can talk about it in the same way as a lot of the intellectual analysis of the content. You know, even the strangeness of this kind of slightly hot pink choice, which I've compared to blood, but it's definitely not the colour of blood. The green, which is quite synthetic looking, we're thinking of a forest hiding a death camp, but this green is nothing natural. There are some really interesting choices, I think, in that suite of works. But again, I'm not entirely sure myself that it's successful, but I would say that it's a very significant work from an artist who has contemplated this subject over the course of his practice. He's a master, and he's someone who's willing to admit and discuss vulnerability in his practice. So therefore, I think it has a really important place, and it's important for us to share the conversation, and I think also, hopefully, even with artists of such stature, to find a way to be honest in our reactions and generous to the intent of the artist and their process, and empathetic to that, but also willing to speak together about how we feel, the end work fits to the task, and also always to encourage others to enter this process through their art making also.
And I'd add a little to that, if I may, that given the overall theme of the exhibition about the life of the image, there's obviously something about those Holocaust images that suggests that there are some images that perhaps should not be reproduced. But that is not to say that you don't remember the events that those images refer to. So on the one hand, yes, I would imagine that Gerhard Richter would see or feel a certain degree of failure in turning away from the representational attempt to reproduce those images, but on the other hand, he's entirely successful in bringing that terrible story and that trauma and the facts of those events back to our thinking and our memory. So, for me, I've actually felt quite uncomfortable about that series to a certain extent, and I've been feeling very cautious about the way that it's included in our exhibition. And one of the things that and I still don't know whether I'm right or wrong about this, but one of the things that I wanted to ensure was that those Sonderkommande images were represented in the exhibition, which is suitable, and that's what Richter would want, but they weren't in that same room, and that they're only reproduced once in our show, so they remain in the Atlas overview room, but they're not within that particular space, just as Richter chose them to not be within that particular space. Now, I know they have been displayed like that elsewhere, including in places like the Friede Bürde Museum, and that was obviously an installation that Richter had a big hand in. But for me, I think there's a real question about, for Richter thinking and responding to those events in terms of, well, there are some images that have a different status, and there are some images that don't circulate in this economy in the same way, and they stop or they cease circulation for very good reasons, but we don't necessarily stop thinking about them. So, and yet again, as with the October series, he returns those events into our consciousness. So for those reasons, I was persuaded that the work had a place here, and also because, given its political dimension as well, that was a part of Richter's practice that we were keen to represent, and without the October series, Birkenau was our another option, another mechanism for us to do that.
Thanks, Rosemary. And we are really keen to, continue the many conversations around this exhibition, having the opportunity to bring all these extraordinary works here. So let us know if you'd like to contribute to that in some way. And certainly on our blog and website and the social media, there's a whole range of opportunities to feed into that conversation. Also, our fabulous, public programs colleagues will be shepherding through quite a range of talks and the beautiful performances by Canticum over the course of the exhibition. So please stay with us and make your contribution. And on that note, could I just ask you to join your hands and thank our speakers here today.